Okay, welcome everyone to this week's nature seminar. And before I introduce today's speaker, I'll just mention the next few. That this series is pretty much every week. We have some fantastic speakers over the last few months, and they're all available online on our YouTube channel, the Biodiversity Oxford YouTube channel, if you want to catch up on them. But I'll mention the ones that we got coming up. So three fantastic speakers. We haven't got one next Friday, but the following Monday on March the 6th, we've got Patrick Greenfield from The Guardian on phantom credits, why rainforest offsets are not working. So some of you may have seen the Guardian article and the storm around that. So Patrick's coming to talk about that and his experience and the arguments around that. And then that same week on the Friday, the 10th of March, we have Michael DePledge from Exeter University on the search for a healthy environment, about environment and health. And then the 17th of March on Friday, we've got Sandra Diaz from the University of Cordoba in Argentina, who's vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And she's talking about the new global biodiversity framework, the good, the bad, and the narratives. So that'll be a really good, that's Friday the 17th of March. So that'll be the last in this term's series. And she was in Montreal and at the heart of lots of those negotiations. So we'll be getting some really interesting insights from her for that. And then after today's talk, we'll have Charlie will talk for a while, we'll have a Q&A, and then there's drinks just down the corridor. So feel free to linger over the drinks reception for more informal conversation. And so it's a pleasure to introduce Charlie. So rewilding is now hugely in the public eye, in the literature. Everyone's talking about it in one form or another, but really the evidence base would not be what it was if it isn't for the work that Charlie and his wife Issy have done in developing some of the project at Knepp over the last decades, and it's been hugely influential in shaping the whole agenda, but also the evidence base around rewilding. And so I'm sure we'll hear about Knepp at the moment, and Knepp is now a hotspot for lots of things. If you follow it on Twitter, there's a whole range of really interesting things happening there, from butterflies to turtle doves to storks. We'll let the latecomers settle in for a moment, and I'll hand over to you. And welcome also to the online audience as well. We've got a good turnout online as well. So over to you. Welcome, Charlie.
Thanks, Yavinder. This is a wonderful image, I think, of we don't get snow anymore, do we? And this is a lovely image of Knepp, showing off its footpaths made by animals. This is a landscape driven and changed by animals. A new habitat creation, a new future is what we're calling it. I'm going to talk about how I think rewilding is a very important part of our landscape and our future in Britain. I may stray off into the rest of the world as well occasionally, but I can't remember what I'm really going to talk about, that bit of it. But what I'm going to concentrate on and seeing if I can tease out how we're seeing rewilding fitting in with the future of our landscape in this country. So I'm going to explore with some images what it might mean to have a rewilded landscape within a farmed landscape, a food production system, and how I think that rewilding is actually a very good ally for food production and our very survival. COP15 in Montreal came away with what we hope is a breakthrough moment. And that breakthrough moment is looking at saving or preserving or helping or creating or capturing some of that 30%, protecting that 30% of our planet, our land, our oceans, our coastal areas, our waters. And that moment, I guess we've got to celebrate, and we've got to think that we can do something positive. And I am very positive. I'm so positive it makes other people wonder why. One of the things that I I play with this idea. Rewilding is so many things for so many different people, and I keep on finding new shorter versions, statements about what rewilding is, and I sort of play a game of trying to find the shortest version I can find. This is a paper that's only just come out, and it's one of the shortest ones I've ever come across. But rewilding, I guess, often is thinking, or the people that think about rewilding is often about apex predators. And I just thought that because of a statement made by Teresa Coffey last Wednesday in her speech in the National Farmers Union Birmingham talk, she talked about the program that government is having in terms of reintroductions. And I thought that I better just include apex predators in this talk. We're all obviously wanting this animal back in our lives. We're wanting it walking around our streets as they do in Brasov and other places in Europe. But perhaps Teresa, Coffey and others are going to stop us getting what we want. And it may take some time to get a wolf and a bear back in our landscape. This is probably a sadness, though, because actually what the movement of rewilding is about bringing back a totally functioning ecosystem. And that will include bears, wolves, lynx. It will include the wonderful golden jackal. It will include the wolverine. It will include some of these animals because they are part of what makes nature nature. I suppose then we just must leave that as an ultimate goal, because perhaps these animals won't do that well at the moment. There isn't really enough space that they can use in a natural way. So perhaps we are wise enough to believe that this is an ultimate goal, but it might not happen anytime soon. I thought it'd be worth just, for those of us who don't really, don't think about rewilding, don't think about our ecosystem that much, I thought it'd be worthwhile just pointing out what an extraordinary place Europe is. Europe is about half the size of North America. It's got about 27 times more brown bears than North America. So Europeans are actually living with these apex predators quite happily in most cases. There's 3 times as many wolves in Europe than there are in North America, because we assume that North America, this wonderful areas of wilderness, Yellowstone and all these extraordinary places, should have many more things than we have in Europe. But actually, Europe is stuffed full of these things. There's a lovely report that's just come out, Rewilding Europe has done it, and it's about the comeback of animals in Europe. And there's this lovely story about how there's such a huge, strong comeback in a lot of species. And not only apex predators, but also their prey species. So we've got to make more space for nature. This is an extraordinary scene, I think. See the speedboat going past. This is an extraordinary scene. It's 30 kilometers outside of one of the biggest ports in Europe. So Rotterdam is 30 kilometers away from this site. Living with nature can be next door to where we live. It doesn't have to be in these remote wilderness sites. And these rewilding projects in Holland invariably have to be close to populations. It's one of the most densely population parts of Europe. And yet here we are looking at this extraordinary site with these viscent playing around in water, trying to cool off in this quite busy waterway. So perhaps without our carnivores, we can look at herbivores for the first phase of restoring nature in Britain. Herbivores are the drivers of systems. Now, we can act as the carnivore, we can control the populations of these herbivores, but we do need these herbivores to run the natural systems. what I'd like to do is place rewilding in our landscape. And I'm going to go through some pictures and images of what I think that means. But before I do that, I just want to just make sure that we're talking from the same page in terms of what rewilding means to a lot of us. This is a schematic that John Lawton came up with. John was the chair of a group of people that came up with a white paper in 2012, making space for nature. The strap line that Tom Chu came up with was more, bigger, better, and joined up. And John got quite excited. He's on the Knepp advisory board. And he got quite excited by rewilding several years ago. And so he started to think about what that meant. And so he came up with this little cartoon, he calls it. And you've got, on this axis, you've got intensity. And then on this axis, you've got power to the 10 to the power of 3 and so on. So this is a very, very long line. Remember those images of Pluto and the sun? Well, that's a very, very long line. And these areas here are huge and enormous areas. But what John is trying to tell us here is where we stand at the moment, is we stand with these tiny little pockets of nature. Tiny pockets, a hectare, 10 hectares. If you ask, which I do every time I come across a group of people involved in nature, what's the sort of scale of what you're running? What's the Wildlife Trust in Sussex? I think the average scale and size of a property is about 20 hectares. So it's tiny. And I've got a friend, Bill Sutherland, who, I mean, I think tongue in cheek, he takes people around projects when dignitaries come to Cambridge, and he'll go and show them what the state of nature is. He'll take them around projects, but one of the projects he goes and shows them is a national nature reserve in the outskirts of Cambridge, and it's about the size of this room. And it's that size because it's surrounded by industrial estate, but it's also being kept alive because it's a very intervention run site, is because there's a yellow loosestrife that has almost disappeared from Britain, but it survives there. So they have to pretend that they're bulls and they dig bull pits, and this yellow loosestrife continues. But Bill is showing people what the state of nature is in Britain. Now, that is very much tongue in cheek. This particular diagram is interesting because the idea of rewilding, if you've rewilded, you've got to the end of which you can never get to. You have sort of ended up in a wilderness, and the definition of wilderness in Europe certainly we can't ever get to. So Britain is out. We can't be a wilderness, so we can never be rewilded. But we can be on a journey where we can get bigger and bigger space for nature, and we can always strive for less and less management. We can always see if we can get to a point where there's self-willed land. I took this image off the internet, and it was taken by a glider pilot up in Cumbria. And I didn't know that at the time. I just thought it was such a wonderful image. I don't know if you've ever come across an advertising campaign from a tonic water company on the tubes and everything. There was these pictures of Mali, and they use bark from a tree in Mali to make their tonic water. And they had this photograph of an image of Mali, and it's this extraordinarily bad, I'm about to say fucked up, landscape. There's a red river running at the bottom of these green hills, which you can see landslides, and they're using this image as a very beautiful, extraordinary image because there's a red river and there's green hills, and they're using it to advertise their product. And that knowledge of ecology and how things work seems to pervade everything we do. So this picture probably was taken as a very good, pretty picture, but I liked it because it had a canal, it had a fragmented landscape using roads, it has a very intensive agricultural system, it has hedges that are tightly cut, it has a plantation wood at the bottom, which is a single species plantation. Now, there may be some interesting things in the background. In fact, with a bit more research, I found out that is a national nature reserve, it's an old quarry, and there is another SSSI over there. But I wanted to take this image and see if I could paint what John Lawton was talking about and in his white paper, but also I wanted to talk about perhaps some of the things that have been transferred into the 25-year environment plan that we now are working on. But I was so crap at doing the imagery myself, I had to go and I did do it, and then I had to go and find someone who could do it properly. And Haroon Helmer is an ecologist first and foremost, but he's also an artist, so he understands what he's drawing, and that's really crucial in all these things. So I'm going to take this and turn it into a cartoon for you. I want you to assume that these two areas here are rewilded. These are newly rewilded sites in this landscape. So how does that impact and how does that work within the whole landscape? Well, before I'm going to delve into that a little bit more, I'm going to talk about Knepp. So what we're doing at Knepp is on a spectrum. It's on a sliding scale. We are limited by scale and size. We're limited by where we are. We're limited by roads. There's lots of limitations. There's limitations from government and regulations. There's limitations. So I'm going to tell you about what we're doing, and we'll just run through that quickly. This is my dad and his two sisters and my uncle, and they're standing just before the real outbreak of war, and they're watching the scrubland that had formed between the two wars on our land, and it had formed because it was an agricultural depression. And the sort of land that we're on without grant and subsidies is the sort of land that reverts very quickly to a state of scrubland, moving on to becoming perhaps woodland. This is where our family lives. It's Knepp, but the reason for showing this photograph is there's the Canadian Army standing in front of the castle. But what you've got there is a wheat field growing in a Repton park, a listed park being ploughed up. And that was the big moment. There's my grandmother, and she's looking on to her red poles, and the attitude changed dramatically. It was that dig for victory, that security of food. The thinking was very much about food production from then on. I did Cirencester for 3 years. I took over the farm age 21. I took over the estate age 22. And that 1,400 hectares of land then became a burden for the next 20 years until I started to rewild. This is actually my daughter, Nancy, and there she is. Nancy has grown up a bit. She's now doing a PhD on natural capital in Oxford with Kathy Willis as her supervisor, and that's wonderful. I'm very proud of that. But what we were experiencing there is the sheer joy of production, of huge quantities of wheat, and the feeling that you were doing something positive. And we've got to understand that. We've got to understand that when we're thinking about how farmers and landowners view their land. It is about production. It's a good feeling when you're sitting on that huge pile of wheat, however poorly it gives you in terms of money. For us, we had this is from 1972 to 1999, and by the end of that period, this is called the Green Revolution, so-called Green Revolution. This is the 1970s when plant pathology and so on took off. And we started to really increase our yields. But Knepp, because of its soil type, couldn't really do much with that. Now, 8.7 tons a hectare for winter wheats is pretty low anyway. So in a modern conventional farming system, you wouldn't be making anything on that now. You would be needing to be around 10 ton a hectare. We were 7 ton a hectare, so way short of a national average. We also had a lot of dairies, and we were going through this whole process of the milk marketing board collapsing, and then the whole new regime and milk prices collapsing. And we were left at the end of the 90s thinking, what are we going to do? And the farm manager wanted to amalgamate all 3 dairy herds and create a super dairy herd. And it was going to cost another $1 million, $1.5 million. We already had an overdraft of $1.5 million. And I just said, no, we're not going to do it. So what are you going to do? Well, Franz Vera, I had met in the late 90s, and his book, his hypothesis came out to Grazing Ecology and Forest History, came out in 2000 in English. that was a good breakthrough moment because I could actually read it and rather than just listen to France. And it was fascinating. I had partly grown up in Africa and Australia, and I was always sort of finding the attitudes to ecology in Europe quite odd. What I was seeing in those countries, Africa and Australia, was something different. And what France was talking about was a sort of language that I had come to expect ecology to mean from those two other countries. So free roaming animals, driving systems, all those thoughts were quite familiar to me. For me, it was a journey of fascinating learning about our planet. And one of the things you've got to do to be a rewilder is understand that, understand what's missing from our environment. This, I love this schematic. It shows, it's really basically man as it marches out of Africa around the planet. It wipes out large herbivores, megafauna. And the thinking there was then, well, what if the Amazon still had this megafauna? What if South America still had this megafauna? What would it look like? And those fascinating ideas behind that. In Britain and in Europe, this is a list of animals that have become extinct in the last few years. And here's a list of animals that have become extinct in Britain. And so the thinking of all that to the rewilder is really thinking about what drives systems and what's possible to bring back, what's possible to use to drive those systems. But now we have to use a lot of proxies, so we can't use that lot. So these are our proxies for Knepp. We've got the Tamworth pig, we've got the Exmoor pony, and we've got the Old English longhorn. So there they are. We've also got rabbits. It always makes people laugh there. So a non-native, Iberian, animal appears, hops across the screen, everyone giggles. Our Tamworth pigs are a keystone species. They have given us the only growing population of turtle doves in the country. They've given us the biggest population of purple emperor butterflies in the country. The way that they rootle, the way that they disturb, the way that they keep things moving is very important, we think. These animals are really making a huge impact, and you don't need many of them. The heavy hitters, the deer. The idea behind the deer, and we have maybe over 700 deer on Knepp, but we still don't have, outside of our woodland, a empty browse line, because there's this battle going on between vegetation succession and this munching of mouths on the vegetation. And that whole idea, and we got someone in the audience, Keith Kirby, who actually was on the journey from the very beginning of Knepp and was a great supporter, to look and explore at what happens with these animals in this landscape. Single stomach, teeth on the top, protruding teeth, nippers. If you watch a horse eating thorn, it's like the end of an elephant's trunk. It can move its lips around. It carries viruses around differently. It has a herd structure that's different. It moves diseases around plants differently. All traits we're not sure about, but traits they are. The Old English longhorn. This is an animal, if you were to put it into a field, a grass field, it would walk to the hedge first. It would then explore the hedge, and then it will come back for a bit of grass if it wanted to get something. So these are all 4 stomachs. It has, I read a paper that said cattle can move 230 different plant species around the landscape. We've got to remember that these animals are all part of moving of plants and moving of nutrients and so on. But these are all traits that these extraordinary animals give us. So we're going for an old breed where they're behaving very differently. Life has poured back into Knepp, and every year we are thrilled and excited by something new. This this last summer, in 2020, we saw the first large tortoiseshell, and we thought it was just this odd happening. This is a butterfly species that hasn't been present in this country for 50 years. Last summer, we found a breeding colony of this butterfly. So this butterfly's made it over the channel. It's now breeding, and it's just one more thing added to the life that has poured back into Knepp. What's Knepp looking like now? So we've gone from this arable arable and dairy farm, and now we have this complex scrub structure. These habitats that are being created, these new habitats of the future, this has created a place where one of the highest densities of breeding songbirds now exists. If you come to Knepp in April, May, when the African migrants are beginning to flood in, you cannot believe the noise levels. It's a visceral gut feeling. It's not a, it's something real, tangible. So come. It's not only good for the breeding birds, but it's also incredibly important for migratory birds. And Tony, who's sitting amongst his fellow ringers, they're catching birds to ring them in nets and showing it off to a whole lot of tourists. Tony has been doing this for 30 years, and he ringed more lesser throats and black caps in 2 fields on Knepp than he ringed in his entire life. So a really important site for feeding up and allowing those birds to migrate back to Africa. Now this is all recorded by us, and we spend a lot of time. We've got 2 full-time ecologists, and we've got a whole load of people coming to do work on Knepp to record on what's happening. At the moment, we've got some really interesting stuff going on, and it's about carbon, and it's been mostly funded by NERC funding, but there's other things going on as well. This is actually there's Nancy gazing at a, what do you think that is? Crete. What do you think it is? Anyway, it's an oak. There's an oak which Nancy's gazing at, which has been goat toperied. But what she is doing is she's looking at destructive sampling. So she'll be taking out the below ground and above ground trees and looking at how much carbon there is in there. But we're doing a lot of work on carbon at the moment with government. So going back to the scheme and this redrawing Britain, we're now assuming that those areas in the corner up there are rewilded spots. And I'm going to call these climate corridors. They could be wildlife corridors, but I'm going to call them climate corridors for the purpose of this talk. The idea about corridors is we are needing to connect and allow movement within our landscape so that things can move. Nutrients can move, animal species can move, plants are carried from one place to another. And it's important because of this. The planet has been divided up into climatic zones, and our climatic zone in this part of Europe is thought to be traveling at about 150 kilometers for every degree change, or 150 meters up. So if we're looking at 2.5 to 2 degree change over the next 50, 60 years, what does that mean? So I thought I love doing these sort of things. I thought, okay, southern France could come to Knepp, and wow, I just think lavender, and actually we're on clay, so probably not. And then southern England is in the borders. So that's the problem. The problem is that how are we going to allow nature to survive without any movement? If we fragment our landscape so much, there's no movement, how are we going to allow this to happen? So the idea of corridors are physical. These are physical corridors, but they could be less physical. I mean, they could be just softer landscapes where things can move through. It doesn't have to be completely a linear line controlled by a rewilded theme. But for me, some of these would need to be rewilded landscapes. Now, one thing you're instantly seeing is a problem. You've got this fragmented landscape, so it's not much use building this corridor because it's still fragmented. So one thing that we do need to consider is building green infrastructure. Now we've got our hedges, which are beginning to look quite interesting. They're billowing out because we've allowed them to get away from the flail mower maybe every 3 or 4 or 5 years. So they're beginning to be more interesting. We're allowing them to spread out a bit more, but we also need these corridors to work and function. I don't know if you know how many of these structures have been built in Britain. If you go through Champagne, I was going to go and look at these the cranes in northern France, and there's a spectacle, 30,000, 70,000 cranes come into this huge reservoir. Driving out there, every 5 kilometers, there was one of these green bridges. So in Britain, I think there's 2.5, I think maybe. I remember applying for to build one of these green infrastructures on a road next to us, and there was 54 million sitting in a pot. But apparently the road that I was wanting to build this bridge over was actually owned by county rather than national, so they couldn't access that money, and that money all went back to Europe without being spent. 3 nightingale territories in this 170-meter stretch of hedge. This is about 14 meters wide now, but it's stopped. The grazing and browsing animals have stopped it moving pretty well any further than that. And you've got dormice back in that hedgerow. So hedges and corridors are part of the story. We know that giving space around the crops in your fields also works. There's been a lot of studies. This is actually a report that came out in 2015, but they've carried on the work, and it continues to be really interesting, the output from that bit of work. So this bit of work is that there is no drop in calories giving back another 8% to nature. So your hedgerow, and then you got your margins on either side of the hedgerow. There was no drop in calories. There's no drop in the amount of food being produced by any given amount of land. Anyway, so this landscape is beginning to look quite interesting now. Regenerative farming, conservation farming, farming with nature, all these ideas are becoming now, at least in some people's minds, mainstream. And that's very exciting. It's probably one of the biggest things that we can do is to get our soils functioning and working again. And regenerative agriculture is about thinking about how you feed soils to get them regenerating. You no longer are thinking about using your soils as a medium to grow stuff. You're actually then thinking about it as a live thing. So this is one of the biggest and most interesting movements. And it's been sparked by a whole lot of books and ideas coming from these people. But in Britain, you have the Cherry brothers, and the Cherry brothers have this thing called Groundswell, and it's now become a must-go-to event. Go. It's the one place you'll find a whole lot of farmers and landowners getting very excited by what each other is saying. One of the things that I was intrigued by once the announcement came that there was going to be 600 million spent on trees back in our landscapes, treescapes. I don't know what they're going to be called, but maybe plantations is more close to it. And one of the things that I wanted to be part of was a move saying, hold on, let's not think about just planting trees. Let's think about complex systems that allow natural colonization to happen outside woodland. And I think that one of the things, so I was part of putting together one of the publications from the Woodland Trust called Woodwise. We put together this thing, and it actually came COVID. We were meant to having a big meeting, everyone was coming, but COVID happened, and then we had to have it online. It was all a bit of a disaster, but we still produced the Woodwise publication. And one of the most interesting articles and talks that Joan Cottrell gave was about biosecurity. It was about security of genetics in plants that are being allowed to find their own way into our landscape. It was about how we ought to be thinking about pollen floating across Europe. There's a picture of pollen coming from Italy across Europe into Britain. Wouldn't that be extraordinary? So if you've got a Quercus roba in the Apennines with pollen finding a flower in a Quercus roba at Knepp, you've then got an acorn which has got this genetic diversity. What about that as an idea? Then you've got to allow space for it to find a home, to grow. And I think that that all needs to be thought about. This is a picture of Knepp and what Knepp looks like in a May day. Absolutely extraordinary. The journey that it would take if you allowed natural colonization to form woodland eventually. The journey to get there would give you this biodiversity, these extraordinary habitats. This is a canalized river. Now, we've got lots of them, and you saw the photograph. It really does exist. We had one on Knepp, and 20 years ago, we re-meandered it. It doesn't quite look as good as this one that Haroun came up with. And Haroun is obviously put, I mean, he's got lovely things like Therese Coffey's links, and he's got one of our beavers, Billy No Mates, or Bramble, or whatever Nancy calls them all. And we've got a braided system now. We've got people, we've got an elk, we've got bison, and we know what happens if we can get water back onto floodplains. It's like rocket fuel. This is an image coming out of a film that's been made about Izzy's book, Wilding. And I just wanted to show, it's just two stills from the film. And I hope I'm allowed to do this from Passion Pictures. But anyway, so this is what we're talking about. This is what we're talking about we need to do. We need to allow those river systems to then relax again. And we need to pay those farmers and landowners to allow this to happen. Some of our cultural landscapes are incredibly important, and maybe just for well-being, but also maybe really quite important to hold on to some of the species that we're going to lose and have lost in our landscapes. So I'm definitely an advocate for having cultural landscape mix within this rewilding landscape that I'm talking about. These cultural landscapes are hay meadow systems, and that hay meadow can be very good for feeding the livestock. So I'm very much for that. But we need to think about where the food is going to come from in the future. Now we know that, or we assume that the planet will head for 10.5 billion people and then start to drop again. But we do have this issue of where food is going to come from. One of the more interesting books on this is George Monbiot's Regenesis. And one of the things that struck me out of Regenesis was that he was talking about precision fermentation, producing proteins and fats and carbohydrates from fermenting using bacteria and hydrogen. And one of the figures that he was looking at, or musing about, I suppose, was in the US, about 37 million hectares are used for soybean. Soybean is the most efficient crop from agriculture in terms of protein. 37 million hectares is planted every year. Now, his figure he was musing about was, if we had a system producing proteins using this fermentation technique, how much land would that take up? It was a sort of simple question. And it was, the answer was about 21,000 hectares. Now, a lot of energy needed to produce bubbling tanks and all the rest of it. But he still sort of played around with that idea, and he thought that he would still come out on top with the amount of protein produced from that. And the land use is the important thing. You release a lot of land needed. The wonderful superfly, and this is an image coming out of the New Scientist. A friend of mine went to see an investment made in fly farming in Canada about, I don't know, I suppose 10, 12 years ago. And he said he couldn't see the end of the building without a pair of binoculars. So it's not about to happen. It's not something being talked about. It's actually happening, this. So what do we all feel about that? What do we all feel about our processed foods containing fats and carbohydrates and proteins from those sorts of systems? Anyway, so I put that in here in this image. So you've got some buildings there which are going to be producing that sort of thing. The last of these things in rebuilding this landscape is plantation woodland. Now, the government spent 3 million quid exploring diseases in oak. It was called Purpose. And one of the predictions that their modelling came out with, at the current rate of death in Quercus robur coming out of Herefordshire, we will have lost 25% of our Quercus robur by 2050. Now, we're losing our ash, we're losing our chestnut, we're losing our larch, we're losing. How are we going to cope with the future? And one of the interesting papers that the Forest Commission came out with, Jonathan Spencer had spent some time in sabbatical just before he retired. He was promoting the idea that we should be looking at also non-natives, so non-native trees to plant for the future, because of the risk of having such few species and thinking about that. But also, how do we manage our woodland? I've painted a picture here where we've ring barked existing trees to get dead wood standing. I've left them standing. I haven't cut them down. I haven't worried about the people walking around the wood and getting fallen over with a dead tree. I've painted a picture of a rich woodland. Now, there's lots of different ways to manage woodland, and there's very good ways to manage woodland to produce good nature. It's invariably not about leaving woodland to do nothing. Leaving woodland to do nothing, you end up with a very dark, good place for fungi, and that's about it. I'm saying that with trepidation because Keith Kirby's in here, and others. So this cartoon that I've been working on, this is a farming landscape with rewilding in it. So rewilding as a crucial part of that landscape. Around the world, as you saw in the COP15 statement from Montreal, we're going to try to redirect the 500 billion spent on bad subsidies. But at the moment, we do spend 500 to 600 billion on farm subsidies. In the UK, we're committing to about 2.7 billion, and that is questionable about which direction that's going to take us, but we'll see. Maybe we can be positive about that. Yeah. So this rebuilding of this landscape, and it's fun, isn't it, when it moves and things, but that's... But I want to then talk about the money side of things. And I'm going to talk about how I see this one project that I'm involved in using the latest thinking on money. We think that we're about 700 billion per year short of what we need to spend to hold on to and start to restore ecosystems for biodiversity. In the UK, we are talking about a 6 billion price tag. So there's the 2.7 billion that the government might spend on nature, but we're then short, we think, of about 6 billion. So how are we going to find that 6 billion? Now, there's lots of ways, perhaps, and it's an exciting world out there. If you're thinking about carbon credits and biodiversity credits, there's a lot of noise and a lot of extraordinary thinking going on. I'm going to talk about one of those ideas on a particular project that I'm involved in. About 2 years ago, we set up a company called Nightingale, and Nightingale was set up to take it was asking funders to believe that we could sell natural capital and then set up a tourism business that would allow that land to continue in perpetuity for nature. So quite a big call, but we found the funders, we found the people that were willing to take that risk. And the story we gave them, and it is a story because it's fictional at the moment, but we hope it will become reality, is this. And this is applicable to any of us who want to do projects on our own land. So here's your project. How are we going to fund it? Now, if you're an NGO or a charity, maybe you're going to be talking about grants from philanthropy. Public bodies. Well, we know what that's like. We've got countryside stewardship, we've got environmental land management, we've got payments for ecosystem services, all coming in to fund your project. Corporates. Now, this is the new bit. Now, this may be just corporate social responsibility grants. This is companies loving what you're proposing to do and wanting to be part of it. Rewilding has just been funded by a company to buy land and to rewild down in Somerset. And they're not getting carbon credits or biodiversity credits from it. They're just doing it because it's a good thing to do. Payments for ecosystem services. Well, we've got carbon credits, and that is about a 900 billion market at the moment, and that was last year's figure. We've got biodiversity credits, which is a new idea that we can actually monetize and think about biodiversity as a credit scheme and a system. We've got biodiversity net gain. This is the developers having to offset what they destroy on developing land by at least 10% uplift. And then we've got nutrient credits and others. So the corporate bit of this puzzle, and this is what government's wanting from us. It's wanting a partnership. It's wanting to work with other seams of money. The bit that, and then there's volunteer time. We have about 180 volunteers at Knepp. We have projects that have been crowdfunding, and that's been brilliant. Ecotourism is certainly something that we get money from. That's people that buy into what you're doing and wanting to come and then get to see what you're doing. And then you've got meat production, and the meat production is because what we've already explained. You need to control the numbers of your population, thus you bring out meat, and so people support you through buying your meat. We also have turned at Knepp a lot of buildings into alternative uses. And we've got about 200 people now, full-time equivalents, employed in those buildings. And then you've got the investors, the impact investors. And that's the bit I'm going to talk further about, because that's the Nightingale model. So the money comes back to those investors through being able to organize all this lot in your change, in your conservation funding change. These are the first two properties that Nightingale has bought. The first one is up in Lincolnshire, it's about a few miles south of Grantham. It's a grade 3 arable land. 92% of it's ploughed, 3% woodland, 3% is grassland. And it's I've been told it's very typical for that part of Lincolnshire. We are going to rewild it. So how are we going to do that? One of the, and this is breaking news, because I only got this 3 days ago, and it's the results from a bit of work that NERF has funded through this partnership down here. And AgriCarbon, this is their equipment that drills down about 1 meter, and we look at 3 depths of the soil, 4 depths actually, and we look at how much carbon is being stored. These are the results from those tests. And so you've got a control, you've got some arable land and that figure, then you've got conventional grassland and so on until you get to the rewilding project and you start to get these sorts of figures. And then you've got woodland at the top there. Now, the only person in the room that I know will understand completely about this is Charles Godfrey, who's now talking to Yavinda about something. And Charles will understand this stuff because I don't understand it. But this figure here is what the AgriCarbon team are very excited by. This is not counting the above or below ground vegetation growth. So we've got about 37,000 cubic meters of vegetation growth as well to add to this figure. But this is Annie Leeson's, the co-founder of, CEO of AgriCarbon, what she says about it. Now, Charles, I'd love to know what you think, and Yavinda, I would like to know. I mean, she hasn't done obviously exhaustive search, but she is very excited by this result, and I'm not sure why, but anyway, you can help me. So that's going to be one of the main streams of income for this change, funding this change from a arable farm to a rewilded site, and returning money to the investor, and that's really important. Because if we can tap into money that can come into nature through a monetary system, there is unlimited amount of capital out there that will do it. So it is important. I understand there'll be different views on that. This is the second site. It's a wonderful site. It's got a cut and it's got a lode. It's in the fens and it's got the River Wissey. And so it's isolated from all the land around it. It doesn't need to meet the neighbour and say, we're wanting to wet this up. Do you mind? We can just do it because it's a bowl. And in the middle here, you've got a clay hill. They call them hills. It's about 2.5 meters high. And you've got another hill here, which is a chalk hill. And we are planning to rewild this site, and we will turn it into maybe something like this picture of the Okavango. I can test then that rewilding and farming should and could work together. If we have this ambition of 30% of our landscape being protected in some way for nature, how else are we going to do it? How else are we going to bleed in nature and food production at a cost-effective way without over-management? So I would always promote this idea of rewilding. I'm going to finish off just by plugging a book. A lot of my friends would be very surprised at this because having my name on a book, I can't read or write, and actually having my name on a book is a bit of a wonder. But anyway, Izzy thinks I'm worthy of joining her on the front cover of this book. This is coming out in May, and we're very excited by it. It's about 520 pages, and it could kill someone at least if that's what you want to do. I'm finishing now. This is Walter. This is the Marchioness of Heppel. And the Marchioness of Heppel, he's actually called Walter Riddle, and Walter produces gin. And this is not his gin, I don't think, because he was actually in the morning. But it's the joy of seeing a whole lot of rewilding projects in Holland, of all places, and thinking, wow, we can do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Amazing images and videos as well. So really, really inspiring. So we can open up to questions now. Does anybody want to kick off some questions? Ian?
Charlie, thanks very much indeed. That was fantastic. Again, thanks very much indeed. That was fantastic. And I want to take you back to your photo with Nancy, I think, on the wheat or the barley, whatever it was. And you said this was about a good feeling. And you've given us a lot of good feelings here. But I then want to contrast that with the definition you gave at the start, which included the phrase, I think, reducing human control for rewilding. If I'm a Sun reader, I've just left the room because I'm now no longer relevant, if you like. And I just wonder whether we need to rephrase that with a positive statement about human contribution rather than reducing, to appeal to a much wider group of audience.
I'm so lucky it wasn't my statement. I think one of the things that's been really completely wonderful for us, and also rewilding projects all around Europe that I know of, is that engagement from people increases. Now, Knepp has gone from 23 people employed to over 50. And we're about to get another 40 because my son's building a cafe and shop. And this is all about nature and people coming into nature and experiencing nature. So I think as long as we can do that sensitively, and we don't want to flood these landscapes with people because nature reacts, it does have an effect. But for me, all I can see is everywhere that we're doing this, we get more people into those landscapes, more people involved. 180 volunteers wouldn't have been there. 27 people wouldn't be there working on the land without this project. So I can only see the positive side. I think perhaps that statement is talking about it's the management of nature. It's that fiddling. It's the going in and cutting the scrub or disturbing something or digging a pond or all of those sorts of interventions. You can do early stage interventions, get the whole thing running and moving, and then take that management off and allow natural systems to then take you forward, is how I see it.
I'll pop in a question. Last week, we had a really interesting debate here about should we put a price on nature? And the arguments were on the side of no, we shouldn't at all. It's dangerous. It's commodification of nature. And Bob Costanza was arguing it's worth putting a value, but not a price on nature. Now, what they argue with that national capital is putting a price on nature. And so I was wondering if you had been in that debate, what would be your response to those arguments?
I think it's a really simple one. And for me, I'm a simple man. I'm actually involved in 3 different projects taking natural capital to do things on the ground. And I know that these projects that I'm involved in wouldn't happen without that money. A cloud forest in Honduras, 1,800 hectares, the last remnant of a 20,000 hectare cloud forest, is being saved by GlaxoSmithKline through the sale of natural capital. The rebuilding of a mangrove with a community in Honduras is being rebuilt with natural capital money from the NatWest Bank. These are real projects happening on the ground and making huge changes. Now, they're complex and difficult, and you know, these parts of the world with perhaps less governance than the Western world makes it riskier and more exciting, I guess. But you're doing real things. Now, Nightingale is doing real things. If it works, it will turn that bit of ploughed land into a Knepp, and it will have life pouring back in it, and it will be important regionally for life. Now, that is physically happening because we are going to be able to sell carbon and biodiversity credits. So I don't really understand, I can understand some of the arguments, but all I'm saying is I think we can actually physically do this stuff because the money is there. They're wanting to spend it. They, being the private sector, is wanting to spend it. Now, they may have reasons that we don't agree with, but they are spending the money and the money is flowing.
It's Charles.
Oh God, Charles.
Charlie, that was fabulous. And as an entomologist, the number of purple emperors you have at Knepp just completely blows my mind. As you know, the DEFRA, the government, is committed to come up with a land use plan for England, I think, by the end of the year. And I guess I have 2 questions. One is, what would you like in that would help bring forward some of the things you just talked about? And what do you think will actually be in it?
Well, I'm positive here, Charles. I mean, Charles is actually a very important person within DEFRA as well. So, you know, just to, is not just an entomologist, okay? Oh, okay, sorry, Charles. Anyway, at the moment, you've got a lot of funding going out there looking at landscape recovery, looking at these carbon things we're talking about on Knepp. And I think in the next two or 3 years, we will start to have some really interesting results coming out. And I think that will help us decide and drive the future management of our land. Now, if we can soften the swings and balances of politicians, and we allow a little bit of this information to take hold and to become an informative and interesting part of our thinking, then I think we can come up with some really interesting future landscapes. I think I've already painted what I think it should be, and that was this cartoon. And it went around DEFRA, that moving cartoon. They asked for it, and I had lots of people ring me up from DEFRA because it had done the rounds, and they sort of liked it enough to think it might be a good thing to do, is actually expand that idea and actually give that sort of cartoon a bit more of a boost. But Charles, I don't know, you know so much more than me, but I'm feeling confident. Therese coffee.
Hello, sir. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Bilal. Oh.
That's okay. That should be online.
Okay. So my name is Bilal. I am from Wildlife Conservation Research Unit. My question is that when we talk about rewilding, the first thing that came into our mind is rewilding Europe or rewilding of some large state in England. But what about the developing countries? What about like India, Pakistan, where we got some of the largest populations, human populations of the world, and most of the people only have like 3 acres of land that sustain their whole families. So how we are going to achieve rewilding in those areas of the world? Thanks.
Well, as far as I know, it's already happening. I've seen projects written about and reconnecting existing hotspots for nature, mostly to do with tigers and moving tigers around the landscape. But is it going to be about productivity? Is it going to be about how we produce our food? I don't know enough, I'm afraid, but I'm still hopeful that we can not only hold on to what we've got, but also think more intelligently about what we have got and how we're going to connect and reconnect those landscapes. And that'll be a big part. I mean, there's huge, vast areas of India that I've been to bits of that feel very wild and still very remote. So I'm sort of hopeful. I don't know enough, though, I'm afraid. Yeah, I've been to those. I don't know.
Hi, I just wanted to go back and talk a bit more about food production and the farming side of things. We saw like some alternatives of protein production and all of that, but I was wondering if we go for the 30% of rewilding or of giving back land to nature, while those like food production alternatives are not yet there and they're not ready to work in a sustainable way. And like right now we are not there yet. And especially we don't have the sources of green energy, for example, for the greenhouses, etc., etc. How do we rewild and continue to rewild without basically exporting the issues of our food production into more vulnerable regions and ecosystem of this planet?
Yes, I'm afraid it's Weasley words though, isn't it? Because this is only protecting 30%. So in England, you'll already have a lot of the land that would be considered to be good for nature. So maybe there's already 20% or 22% that is already good for nature. So you're only adding another 10% to that. So the strive isn't that big. I guess in terms of, you know, in the UK, we produce around 60% of our consumed calories in this country. And it's mostly, we've got a lot of exports, we've got a lot of things that other people are wanting, but 60% and the 40% that comes in from Tesco, talking to Tesco's a couple of weeks ago, most of their external produce comes from Kenya, for instance, where they're spending lots of money on nature in Kenya. I'm guessing that there was one interesting idea which Professor Benton came up with. And it was when the war was kicking off in Ukraine and Russia had stopped the grain leaving Ukraine. And Tim was talking about a shift in meat consumption of 15% for Europeans would be equivalent to all the grain exported from Ukraine and Russia. So I'm only sort of throwing that in because it's not as simple as, oh dear, you know, if we give 30% back to nature, we're already counting that there's already nature there. So we're not giving 30% back, we're protecting 30%. So a lot of that already exists. So it's not, and quite a lot of that exists and will be extended and expanded in areas that aren't very productive anyway. So it's all these, I mean, it's a complex one, isn't it? And I think, I mean, George's book, Regenesis, actually runs through those arguments quite exhaustively. Have you read Regenesis?
Yes, but I think he also ignores the issue of fertilizer and especially the limited amount of phosphate, for example, in that whole debate, especially around vegan agriculture and more basically urban-based farming, if you want to call it like that.
Well, interesting. I mean, I've been sitting on an advisory board for an agricultural company for 6-7 years. I'm now retired from it, but we were farming around the planet. So we had about 110,000 hectares and about 3,500 people employed. And 6-7 years ago, we committed to reducing our fertilizer inputs by 80% by 2030, including phosphates. We committed to eradicating all synthetic pesticides of any description at all by 2030. And this is a big farming operation, growing complex crops in pretty well every continent of the world. So, I mean, I think, you know, the thinking behind all this is moving fast. It's really interesting. And I think that we don't know enough yet. And that's what's so exciting about probably moving into farming now. Becoming a farmer now is quite an interesting field. It's going to be different. It's going to be looking at the growing systems very differently.
Thank you.
Hi there, Eleanor Miles from Atkins, and I help to, I guess, rewild a lot of the floodplains in the UK. Sorry, and the conversations that I have with farmers, they would be quite apprehensive about some of the large-scale changes that you're talking about here in terms of how many hectares and the sheer volume. Do you think there's a place for kind of pockets of individual fields rewilding in a wider, complex landscape? And how do you have those conversations with farmers, like with your neighbours? What do they think about what you're doing?
I think most farmers that I talk to want to start with what's it worth. So you know, for a farmer, it's a business, and if your gross margin for your enterprise is £1,000 a hectare, what are you offering, and for how long? And what happens at the end of the 30 years that you've agreed to do this for? So all of these are sort of legitimate questions for a farmer to ask, and so I think yes is the answer. You can have pockets and small patches and expanding existing areas where there's high nature worth areas and so on. And that's the idea of the cores and the corridors and the stepping stone idea that has now been talked about for 20 years. So I think you need to talk about, you know, it's not always going to be altruistic. It's going to be, this is going to affect my business and it's going to affect my enterprises, and that effect has to be compensated for. So what's the compensation? It's a sort of pretty simple one for most farmers.
Yeah, I'll take one from online now. So I'll just read it out. This is from Seven Bliss. What's the progress being made on a new wild welfare standard? Obviously, the welfare standards for rewilded animals are different to domestic animals in terms of handling and transport and slaughter. So
there's a large herbivore group being formed. There was one before in England called GAP, but there's a new one just being formed, which is including quite a few Europeans in it. I can, if someone gets in touch with me, charlie@knepp.co.uk, I can respond and give them a link to that body.
okay, great. I'll do one more from online. This is from Daniel Schaaf. Can UK farming achieve the National Farmers Union targeted net zero by 2040 without offsetting, whatever that might mean?
I think when we all committed to these figures, we had no idea how to do it, but we just assumed it could. So I'm guessing not. But you know, I really want to talk to Charles about my figures. If that, you know, that 4.8 per year CO2 is that relevant? I don't know. Anyway, he's nodding his head.
Okay. We'll take from there. Yeah.
Hi,
I thought it was really interesting what you were saying around, you know, obviously compensating farmers, but persuading people that this is where the money is. My question is, what happens if someone persuades them that no, it's not? This isn't a problem that's going to be solved in 30 years and then we can ignore it. It's going to be an ongoing concern. And, you know, the market is not famous for being static. How do we get people to invest in what is now considered an externality? How do we get farmers to think about, or how do we enable farmers perhaps to think about, well, in the short term, this might not get me the highest profit margins, but in the long term, the land will still be here in X number of years.
The average age of the English farmer is 58. A lot of farmers are not going to get their heads around natural capital. It's quite right. They're not going to do it. That's why we need a younger, vibrant farming community taking on this land management. We've got to find ways to actually get the new generation to come in and actually be able to think about these sorts of things, as these are quite complex. The other side of it, though, is that we have, I was in a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and around the table was some very big corporates. And we were discussing what they were wanting to see in terms of supply line for the money that was sitting there waiting to be invested in nature. And the sort of general discussion came to the risks, the external risks that they were perceiving. One of them is if you're perceived to be a dirty company, in your DNA, and it's perceived to be dirty and not doing anything for the planet, you don't want that. Your product needs to have a shine on it. The other thing which was quite interesting was that they were saying that it's becoming more difficult to employ the right people if you are a dirty company. And that's really interesting, isn't it? So there's a need to do something from these companies. They are feeling the pressure with the Carney measures now that you're having to report on your behavior. The marketplace knows where you sit. So that's a real pressure. It's a real pressure. And that means they're wanting to spend money on mitigation, on offsetting, or whatever it is. And that's partly carbon and it's partly biodiversity. At the moment, the supply line for that is abroad. It's in Honduras, it's Mexico, it's Fiji. It's other than where their markets are. And so what's going to happen, and is happening, is this pressure cooker is building, saying we want to have projects in our own country that we can be seen to be supporting and doing, so that not only our workforce knows what's happening, but our workforce can go and look at these projects. Our customers know that we're doing these things in our country. Having said all that, that then starts to create a bit of a hotspot. Companies are wanting to invest in nature in our country. Most of their business is happening in this country. For instance, these companies that I was sitting around the table with, and they want the supply line. What does that mean? It means that the value of supplying those goods and services will start to increase, because they'll get to a point when they just need to do it. They need to get these projects off the ground. So I think what we'll see is the prices moving up enough to then start to make it worthwhile for small change, large change, but change.
But how do you maintain that long term?
Well, for the Nightingale model, you've got a sort of 30. For rewilding, you've got sort of 3 stages, perhaps. You've got the sort of first initial stage, the transition from arable ground to scrubland to the beginnings of a wood pasture system. Then that's the sort of first 30 years. The next 30 years is that wood pasture system becoming more mature. And that's another tranche of change in terms of carbon and biodiversity. And then you've got the sort of last phase, which is the maturing of all that, the oak trees becoming old and gnarled, the system becoming more and more complex in time. Again, a change. So you could think of a rewilding system to always be in these 3 tranches of 30 years apart, say, and you could then look for funding during that 100-year period. That's a pretty long time. 30 years is a pretty long time. It's a generational change, isn't it? So we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if that is a model that people will like. But at the moment, say you sign up for 30 years, that period is then the money's coming in for the change from natural capital sales. And then meantime, you're then trying to work out how you're going to make it sustainable in the future. For Nattergal, we think that's a tourism model. It's copying what we did at Knepp. And Knepp has a camping, glamping and safari business, which turns over £1 million, and it makes about £300,000 profit. And we don't want that to be a very big business. We restrict how many people can come because we don't, it's our home and we don't want too many people. So other models could be more free with that. They could maybe put another 10, 20% on top of that model. So suddenly it becomes a sustainable model for, a 2,000 acre bit of land in England. So I think we need to think imaginatively about it, but I think we can do it. I hope we can.
I'm interested in the size of the ecotourism market. Have you got any sort of insights into that? What have you seen? Have you seen the market grow? Where are they coming from? Are they coming to you rather than going abroad, etc.? And I was thinking, if there are lots more wilding sites up and down the UK, are there lots more people that we can turn into ecotourists?
The answer is I have absolutely no knowledge at all about the tourism market. What I can say is that, we're a little drop in the ocean. I mean, say there's 8,000 to 10,000 visitors that come to Knepp. They're either staying or they're coming on safari. We've got over 1,000 safari days booked this year. And those are small groups of 12 people. So there's sort of small but constant groups going out and looking at that environment. But that's a tiny drop in the population of 60, 70 million. And the people that are coming, we've geared it so that you can either pitch a tent or you can come in a glamping. If you don't like camping, then you can have Egyptian cotton sheets and water by your bed. So I think, I don't know, it feels to me that there's, what we're talking about at Knepp is we're talking about an educational program. So we want you to come and experience something about your own environment, your own ecology that you didn't know before. So it's sort of geared around that. And I think that's sort of endless. We all want to learn, I think, and it's fun learning and it's fun experiencing things we're not used to and learning something new. So I don't know the answer to that, but I'm just guessing there's a long way to go before we become a saturated campsite, glamping sites.
I think you're making it.
There was a question right up the back there. It was been keep on hand going up. But...
Thank you very much. My question relates to land as a source of wealth, but also one major source of inequality. And I'm just wondering how you deal with the risk of, land is very unevenly distributed. How you deal with the risk of people who have access, like huge access to land, using rewilding as a tool to essentially, gain more access to public funds.
Yes, it's something I'm probably going to have to hand over to someone else. I'm so white privileged toff living in a castle in West Sussex, who's inherited the land. For me, this whole story of where nature sits, whether it's within community land, whether it's in common land, whether it's in private land, whether it's, the big movement in the UK has been these cluster farm groups forming. There's cluster farm groups that now have 60,000 acres. And some of those cluster farm groups, I went to a cluster farm group, which is a smallholders farm group up in Lincolnshire. And there were small units that they were all coming together to think about how they could how they could make space for nature within their businesses. I don't really know how to answer that. Rather pathetic, I know, but sorry.
Thanks for a great presentation, and also really nice discussion afterwards. I had a question about how rewilding, how you think about it in comparison to restoration ecology and ecological restoration in general, which are pretty old fields. I'm a restoration ecologist, and I'm just trying to get a better handle on it. It seems like there are definitely some overlaps, but the restoration ecology field has, you know, very rigorous kind of approach to planning and evaluation. And I'm just wondering how you see them next to each other, and if rewilding is headed in a bit more of a structured direction or not.
I absolutely, and I think probably the first thing to say is a lot of it may be just a sexy word used for restoration ecology. I've just been toying with a very big machine doing this rough and loose technique on a bank side, where I'm roughing up this smooth surface of this big bank to have the seed raining down from around about, to then see if I can create a woodland on this bit of thing. And we're monitoring it very closely and looking at it very closely. I guess I wouldn't call that rewilding. I wouldn't. This is an attempt to get a bit of land colonized by trees, but it'll be quite intervention led. It will be perhaps tracking out seed to see if we can encourage that to happen, and so on. I know what you're asking, and I was about to say, in our book we have a page dedicated to the differences. So 2 lists of conventional conservation rather than, but also then rewilded, and I think a lot of it is about the attitude you come to a problem. I'm sorry, I'm being rather pathetic. And it's partly because I can't really remember what the page says.
It's a bit about what you're trying to restore to, and then it's about baselines. Whereas I feel like,
of course, thank you. Thank you.
Let's let it go and see what happens. Whereas
So that,
more about
so it is certainly about the process rather than the outcome. So I mean, so one of the principles for us at Knepp was always this idea that perhaps, you know, the controls that I have, which are controlling the species that are present, the large herbivore species that are present, and the numbers of those species present, I can control that. And so one of the thoughts was in the early stage of Knepp was we didn't want it to turn into close canopy woodland, but we also didn't want it to remain open and grassland. We wanted it to be there in the middle. And so the parameters we sort of set was no less than 20% scrub and woodland, no more than 40% scrub and woodland. So those were already restricting the thoughts and patterns of what you then go out and do, but it's still a pretty broad church then. So you're then playing around with the species and the numbers of those species within that landscape to achieve roughly that goal, but it's a pretty rough goal, isn't it? And I guess if you were doing being a restoration ecologist, you would work out, well, actually we want X amount of percent of this, I don't know. Would you? And then you would set about trying to create that environment. And we're talking about, I suppose, scale as well, and the cost of doing these things. You know, the cost of doing Knepp was setting the scene, building the fences, buying the animals in, re-meandering the river, and then putting the animals in there, and then stepping back from it. With health and welfare is pretty well your only issue. So you're not feeding animals, you're allowing this then to rip. And I guess you wouldn't do that if you were managing an SSSI in Cumbria. You would need to control it much more closely and carefully, because your site would be designated for certain species that you need certain management to achieve. I'm becoming tired and rather flummoxed by all these questions. Maybe maybe
I'd like to say after that question, but you've done extremely well. I think we've given you a very decent grilling there, as you would expect coming in, I think. And there's lots of wine just around the corner. So thank you once again, Charlie, for a really inspiring and really fascinating presentation.
Thank you, Vance, and thank you for inviting me. Oh yes.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I really enjoyed that.